There is some literature showing that in ketogenic diets that the results are somewhat compromised. I mean, in a bodybuilding style routine, so if you're training multiple sets, this has been shown quite compellingly, multiple sets for 8 to 12 reps, the majority, roughly 70, 80% of the energy that is utilized is from glycogen stores. Now, you're going to get some glycogen from gluconeogenesis, or you can, depending on the type of diet that you have. I don't think it's going to be a huge difference, but again, if you're the average person who just wants to make some gains, probably it's not going to be practically meaningful. But for a bodybuilder, I certainly would recommend that they would not do a ketogenic diet, that would not optimize. Certainly, I think the literature suggests that it would not be optimal.
Okay, good morning. Hope everybody can hear me. We have a special guest today. We got Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Brad, correct me if I'm saying that wrong, but
Perfect.
Where are you located, Brad?
Right outside of New York City.
Outside of New York City. Okay. Well, thank you for doing this, by the way. I've been following your stuff for quite a number of years. As someone who's interested in athletic performance myself, I think it's great that, you're able to chat with us. My health, my focus has been on health as a physician. So we're trying to get people healthy, but at the same time, this tails into health, being
Sure.
lean mass and stuff like that. So for those that aren't aware of what you do, can you just tell us your background if you don't mind?
Sure. I'm a professor at Lehman College in the Bronx. I'm the program director for the Graduate Studies program, master's degree program in human performance and fitness. I'm an author. I'm a researcher. I'm an educator. And basically my goal in life is to, I have several, but the primary one is to educate the public on evidence-based practice and how to really take a critical view of exercise-related research and how to apply that in practice to improve their lives.
And you've been quite prolific. I've seen you saw so many review articles, and I think I interviewed Alan Aragon about a month or two ago, and I know you guys have recently collaborated. Let me ask you, there was a study I think he was talking about looking at age-associated anabolic resistance or sarcopenic type thing, and you've done some research on that. Would you mind sharing some of the conclusions about, because that's something we want to avoid. I'm a guy who's in my mid-50s, and I'm not looking forward to, fading away or anytime soon. So what do we do to prevent, what does the literature show us on that? And what do we do to sort of mitigate it?
Yeah, well, Alan and I collaborated, as you pointed out recently, on a paper on that. So I think it's first best to give a little context. So as people age, and generally it occurs with sedentary behavior, but just the aging process alone will bring about some anabolic resistance, meaning that anabolic stimuli are not as easily transduced into gains, if you will, into muscular gains. And that can be protein, that can be resistance training. It's just the muscles become less sensitive to anabolic stimuli. And, what can you do? First of all, generally speaking, you can stay active, and particularly resistance train. That's first and foremost. And it's been shown quite conclusively that if you consistently resistance train, you can stave off at least a good deal of the anabolic resistance. Often consuming more protein, particularly on a per meal basis, becomes necessary as people get older. So the amount required to stimulate anabolism, the per dose amount, tends to go up. And that has to do with what's called the leucine threshold. So leucine is one of the essential amino acids, and it's been shown that leucine kickstarts the anabolic process, particularly after the resistance training bout, but just in general. So we know that amino acids are the building blocks of our tissues and muscles, in particular here. And that generally speaking, as you age, you're going to need a greater per dose meal to get to that leucine threshold.
Yeah, I chatted with Don Lehman, who I think is one of the ones who principally described that phenomenon, the leucine threshold. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was like 2.5 to 3 grams per meal or somewhere in that neighborhood. How much of a difference are we talking about between a 20-year-old and, say, a 70-year-old? Like what numbers are we looking at?
Yeah, so again, this is where there has to be some context given. We can throw about numbers like 2 grams versus 3 grams, but you have to remember those are averages, and body size certainly, at least in my opinion, will play a big role in that. So a lot of times as people get older, they're losing mass, and the amount on a per dose basis isn't as great in that respect. But I mean, some of the general numbers that have been thrown around is an increase from 2 grams in younger people to 3 grams of leucine are necessary on a per meal basis. But again, those are very general mean values.
Yeah, and Don was talking about the fact, this sort of per meal, and he said the effect kind of after about 2 meals, it doesn't really, you don't get much by eating 6 meals a day. Some bodybuilders they would eat every 2 to 3 hours. They'd be getting up at 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning to eat. That probably doesn't make that much of a difference, does it?
No, we actually published a paper on this. Actually, it was with Alan, who's a co-author on that as well. And our conclusions were probably 4 meals seem to be, if you want to absolutely optimize muscle protein synthesis, probably 4 fairly evenly spaced meals would do that. So let's say for a bodybuilder, for the average population, the average person, probably 3 meals is fine, even 2. It's not going to be that much of a difference. If you're eating 1 meal a day, then you're going to be probably in trouble there. But I mean, even your intermittent fasting protocols aren't going to make that big a difference, provided they're spaced out like over 8 hours or so. So let's say 2 meals over 8 hours. If you're looking at it at the acute data, it probably would not be ideal. But from a longitudinal standpoint, when we actually look at studies that have tracked intermittent fasting, let's say a 16-8 diet, which is 8 hours of eating and 16 hours of fasting, doesn't seem to show that big a difference between eating more regularly.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. People, the difference when you start talking, am I going to eat 4 meals a day versus 3 or 2? It's like, it's a difference, but it's not huge for the average person. It's like, right. Is it convenient for me to make 4 meals a day? Probably not. I'm a guy that tends to eat 2 meals a day most of the time. That's just from convenience standpoint, works pretty well for me. What about, so protein, there's, it's 1.5 grams per kilogram. I mean, it's, how do we determine, and I agree with you on the size thing. I'm a 6'5", 255-pound guy right now. I got to eat more than somebody else, obviously. And, like the leucine I need is more than the 110-pound female. But how much protein are we getting some sort of coalescence around what is, the ideal amount? I know some people quote as high as 2.6. I've seen Jacob Wilson, and I know a lot of people have been critical of his work, but it's like, do you need that much, or what can we get away with?
Yeah, so the bulk of the data indicate probably around 1.6, perhaps to 1.8 grams per kilogram for someone who's resistance training. So when you resistance train, you need roughly double the amount of someone who's sedentary. Even someone who's sedentary needs more, at least some of the newer evidence, than the RDA. Probably a sedentary person might need around 1 gram per kilogram. And as someone gets older, that's probably increasing a little, even for sedentary individuals. But for a resistance training individual, which for me, everyone should be lifting weights. Yeah. And the literature clearly shows you need substantially more than a sedentary individual. Somewhere, the data suggests somewhere around 1.6 to 1.8. Now, again, that's somewhat nuanced. The volume of training might enter into it. So it could be some of the upper confidence intervals in well-trained individuals are as high as 2.0 to 2.2. So if you want to encapsulate, kind of be on the safe side, my general recommendation is to probably be in that range. If you're a bodybuilder, again, for the average person, the difference would not be, in my humble opinion, practically meaningful. But for a bodybuilder, where small differences can make big differences in terms of your small differences in actual muscle growth, can make big differences in a placing in a bodybuilding show. It doesn't make sense not to take in more because there's really no downside to it. Now, there's also some evidence that when you are in a caloric deficit, so if you are dieting to reduce body fat, that your body needs more protein because it's going to tend to leach muscle. And that it could be as high as 2.2 or so in that realm. Again, not a lot of evidence there. I will say this, one important thing is that this is based on lean individuals. So when we talk about these numbers, they're based on, let's say with guys, around 12% body fat. If you are 30% body fat, you're not going to have the same, you can't extrapolate those numbers. You'd have to regress it to what you would be at a lean weight.
So kind of more of an ideal weight type of situation for those numbers. Yeah. What about the so-called anabolic window? I've been doing this, and I can remember back in the 80s and 90s, you had to slam a protein shake within like 7 seconds of your workout, or you'd lose all your gains. I mean, where have we evolved to with that thinking now?
Yes, we've done quite a bit of research on this and published some review papers, and at least to this point, the evidence does not support that, or certainly I shouldn't say it doesn't support. There's this very narrow window, and the analogy I like to use, it's really more of a barn door than a window. So there's certainly a window, but the window is much wider. You don't need to slam a shake the minute you stop training or you go catabolic, and there's some nuance here too. So it will depend upon if you're training fasted or not. So if you're waking up first thing in the morning after, let's say, an 8-10 hour fast, then you're going to need to generally get protein in rather quickly because the body is already catabolic going into that. And food is anabolic and does, until your body gets nutrients, it does not optimize anabolism. But if you've had, let's say, breakfast in the morning and you're training 2 hours after that, there's still sufficient amino acids floating around your circulatory system. So the anabolic effects of a meal last 5 to 6 hours in general. So again, that's why we talked about the how often should you eat. If you're eating every, let's say, 5 hours or so, or 4 or 5 hours, so 4 meals, you're going to be anabolic throughout the whole day. And that's why probably even 3 meals is going to be pretty much just as good. So the bottom line is that certainly anyone who is just a regular trainer, who's a trainee, who's looking just to get some muscle, should not at all worry about that. Just eat your 3-4 meals a day and you'll be fine. If you're a bodybuilder, my general advice is to get something in relatively quickly because it's not going to hurt you. And if it can make a little bit of a difference, which we're not clear it can't, then it's probably worthwhile.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, exceeding the 2 grams per kilo or 2.2 grams per kilo, probably not a big deal. I mean, Jose Antonio has done some work with, I think he was up to like 4 grams per kilo or not with really we saw nothing, no kidney issues, no liver issues. Is that still what the research seems to indicate? It's not problematic to eat a high amount of protein?
In healthy individuals, yeah, and those that have healthy renal function, they're by my reading of the literature, I know there are some people that kind of use, I think they reach a lot and then they'll claim certain potential health risks. They're over extrapolating, in my opinion. But I mean, to me, the literature does not show any detriment to those with healthy kidney function. Certainly, if someone is on dialysis, then that's a different issue and it's outside of my area of expertise, but from the literature I've seen, you do need to be more careful in that.
Yeah, that echoes when I talked to Stu Phillips about the same topic. He said, look, there's no evidence that shows it hurts. And actually, we've seen people that actually have compromised kidney function actually improve it on a higher protein regimen, which is kind of interesting to see as well. So maybe even not in the sick people, it might be helpful. So let me talk a little bit about training because this is in my view, consistency, getting in the gym, doing it is going to be the biggest shift for most people. But then you get in there and it's like how much volume, what's the, intensity. I mean, there's all different ways to measure intensity. What are your thoughts on, are we getting close to an ideal protocol? And I know there's differences between hypertrophy versus strength. Can you maybe touch on if my goal, I think from a longevity and a health standpoint, I think strength tends to be probably more beneficial than muscle hypertrophy. That's what some of the literature I've seen. Maybe you've seen something different. But how do we distinguish between training for strength and muscle size, and what's ideal for both of those perhaps?
Yeah. So when you say that strength is more ideal, you're talking about from a health perspective?
I mean, the studies I've seen looking at, people that live the longest tend to be in the upper tertiles of strength, hand grip, quad strength, and we don't look at, who's got the biggest quads. It's kind of, the strength aspect is what's been studied anyway.
That would be correct, and that it would seem that the reason is because strength is specific to prevention of falls and other quality of life, your ability to be functionally independent. So yeah, but muscle is it's somewhat, you can't disentangle them,
of course,
because muscle, there is certainly a good correlation between muscle size, muscle strength. When it comes to training for one versus the other, heavier loads, so when you're using very heavy loads, are going to promote the greatest increases in strength. The question is, how practically meaningful is that from a qualitative standpoint? And again, if you're a power lifter, yeah. So for power lifters, they're going to get their best. You're going to certainly need to train very close to your 1RMs to optimize your gains and be able to compete as a power lifter. If you're talking about doing functional tasks, number one, they're generally not involved. Most functional tasks are not concerned with lifting the heaviest weight up one time. They're more muscular strength endurance type of tasks, which tend to lend itself to more moderate load training anyway. But even without that, you will get a lot of strength gains even from using very light weights. Training in a 20, 25 RM will produce substantial gains in strength. And you will have good strength as an older individual, or younger individual as well. And I think it gets somewhat muddled when people talk about optimal. So if you're talking about optimal, it's optimal for who? Optimal for a powerlifter is not what your functional capacity or health related benefits are for the average individual. So I don't think there's that much difference. I would not necessarily train a older individual differently for strength. Now, here's a caveat to that. As people get older, they do seem to benefit from doing at least some power training, which means lifting concentrically. So when you're lifting the load, the shortening capacity of the muscle, quickly, very quickly, and then lowering it under control. So what's called the eccentric would be a controlled eccentric. And power is the ability to create force quickly, in simple terms. And when let's say someone, the reason that this seems to be very important from a functional standpoint, an elderly person, a fall is one of the worst things that can happen to an older individual in terms of their mortality. The literature shows that many of those who break their hip are never able to recover proper function. They become functionally dependent. And the ability to react to a fall and reverse it before you actually fall is a power function, not really a strength function. Now, power is built on a foundation of strength. So you certainly do need to increase strength to improve power, but at least having some rapid concentric training, so somewhat explosive, we call it, training, would seem to be beneficial. And we actually published a meta-analysis which showed a modest effect of older individuals who included power training on improving functional capacity.
Because you mentioned the concentric versus eccentric phase, and I know some people may not be familiar with that terminology, but what about like jumping? I'm, like I said, I still do quite a bit of jumping in my training. That obviously there's not a big eccentric phase when you're jumping. You just jump and then you land, and so can that be beneficial as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's called plyometric training.
Right.
The kind of catch-all phrase for that term is plyometric training. And yeah, jumps are power training. So absolutely, they can be beneficial. Now, again, everything is cost benefit. And some older people, you got to be somewhat careful because they're less controlled to jump, and they can land improperly and fracture their ankle. I mean, depends upon if they are osteoporotic or functionally impaired. So these are all things that need to be taken into account. Ultimately, every training, every program designed for every person comes down to their individual needs and abilities. And to say that plyometric training, jumping, et cetera, can be beneficial, yes. Should everyone be doing jumping? No, it depends on the individual.
What about as far as there's a concept of momentary muscular failure, which is often used as an endpoint for intensity. How much should we strive for that? And, some people like you leave one rep in the tank, or some people are like, you've got to just train to full failure. What does the literature seem to support with regard to the level of intensity to make the gains, I guess?
Yeah, so we carried out a meta-analysis on this last year, and the take-home on it was that there really did not seem to be much benefit to going to failure versus not going to failure. Actually, with maximal strength, there seemed to be a slight detriment to it. There was a suggestion of a possible benefit for hypertrophy for trained individuals, but there were issues in terms of that extrapolation. We had to exclude one of the studies, a specific study based on our inclusion criteria. And looking back, if we had included that study, it would have obliterated that finding. So I don't think there's good evidence that you need to go to failure. But I wouldn't discount the fact that there might be, for let's say, a very highly trained individual, we just don't have literature on bodybuilders or, very high level athletes who have been training for very long periods of time. For the vast majority of people, my general extrapolation from the literature is that if you're within anywhere between 1 to 3 repetitions of failure, which is called an RIR, repetitions in reserve, anywhere between 1 to 3 RIR, you're going to see generally as good gains, certainly strength-wise, and probably hypertrophy-wise as you would if you went to failure.
Yeah, so you just leave a couple in the tank, but you're not just doing 2 reps on something you could do 20 for. You still have to push it to a certain level to see the benefit, apparently.
Correct. But one thing I would say too is that I'm not discounting that there might be a benefit to selectively using failure training. I mean, certainly when I'm coaching bodybuilders, which I still do to some extent at this point, I will have them do usually some sets to failure. And by the way, there's so many things that my opinion has shifted on over the years. And this is certainly one of them. I'm a former bodybuilder. I grew up with the go hard or go home philosophy, where every set was taken to failure. A lot of the sets were drop sets or forced reps or, all sorts of specialized training techniques. And over the years, as the research has kind of come out and shown otherwise, my opinions have changed on this and other factors. So I do think like your last set to failure, at least perhaps on more of the single joint movements. So again, it depends upon where you're using it, who's using it, when you're using it, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, training squats to failure is not a good idea. You don't want to collapse and risk, under a heavy load on your back. So, I mean, there's different things you can do. And let's talk about a little bit. There's this concept, this mind-muscle connection, and a lot of bodies will say you got to think about contracting the muscle, and that's but the research maybe doesn't support that, or does it?
Yeah, so to date, we have carried out the only controlled study on the topic. There's been some EMG studies. So EMG is electromyography. It shows the electrical activity, basically the neural drive to a muscle. And EMG does show that when you give a command to you adopt an internal focus. So when you're getting cued to think about the muscle, which is a mind-muscle connection, you can selectively get greater activation of that muscle. The question is, does that promote better muscle development? And we carried out a study on this topic. And it was very interesting. We looked at the biceps and the quads. We did a curl and a leg extension with the subjects. And they did see the mind muscle produced roughly double the gains in the curl in the biceps. So the biceps brachii got double the gains when you had a mind-muscle connection versus when you had what's called an external focus, meaning you're thinking about just getting the weight up. However, in the quads, there was no difference in the results. And we can speculate. Obviously, we didn't do mechanistic work, so it's tough to know why. Could it have just been by chance that happened? But it's also possible that people tend to get better mind-muscle connections in the arms and the upper extremities than they do in the legs. And we actually, in our exit interviews with the subjects in the study, we did get that feedback that some of them were not able to really target their quads as well through a mind muscle. And could that have been the issue? It's possible, but it does. I will say this, it's one study and we need a lot more work to really draw evidence-based conclusions.
I mean, it's probably safe to say it doesn't hurt. It probably doesn't, there's probably no detrimental effect to doing that, right?
For hypertrophy, for strength, it actually might be detrimental because strength, you're just looking to get the weight up. Yeah. The importance of strength is just to move the weight. So there could be a dichotomous benefit where if you're training for strength, you might want to have more of a external focus, and for hypertrophy, more of an internal focus.
Right. So if I'm going to do a big deadlift, I'm not thinking about squeezing my spinal erectors. I'm thinking about ripping the damn bar off the ground, right? Basically, right. Yeah. What about, because I think there was a systematic review that came out maybe a year or two ago. I think you were on one of the authors, and they talked about this overall arching thing on training. And one of the things was frequency. How often do you need the muscles? How much volume should you hit per week? And I think I saw something around 10 sets per muscle group per week. Is that something that you were involved with, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to our position stand. So I chaired a position stand recently, and we had some of the top minds in the field collaborated. Stu Phillips, who you mentioned, was on it. Eric Helms, Jozo Gurgic, Andrew Vygotsky, James Steele, James Fisher, Cody Hahn. So we're just a really solid group of some of the top minds in the field. And we came to a consensus. Basically, we shared our opinions and drew from the literature and said, how can we put this into a position stand? And so we tried to do that for all the variables, or most of the variables. And for volume, the evidence does seem to show that kind of a minimum threshold is around 10 sets per muscle per week. And again, these aren't hard numbers. See, people like I always am somewhat hesitant to even give these because people think I need to hit that 10 sets per muscle. So if I hit 9, I'm failing. I'm not going to gain. As long as I get to 10, I'm good. It doesn't work like that. And it's always individual. Some people can thrive on lower volumes. Some people need more. And we, again, talk about nuances here that all muscles do not necessarily need the same volume. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all prescriptions. There is specialization. There's theories of specialization, which I share, that perhaps muscles that are lagging should be hit with higher volumes. You should use more volume for lagging muscles and lower volumes for those that are more well-developed. There's also periodizing volumes where you can do, let's say, 10 sets for a month, 15 sets for the next month, 20 sets, and then rinse and repeat type of thing, have an active recovery. Where your volume is also multi-joint for single joint, so you can generally tolerate more volume for single joint movements than multi-joint. So again, these are very nuanced topics, and everyone just wants, give me the simple, one size fits all, but it really does a disservice for those who want to optimize. For the average public, these are, if I'm talking to someone who's a stockbroker and says, I want to gain some muscle and stuff, they can do that on quite low volume routines, very simple routines. If your goal is to be a bodybuilder or just to optimize your own genetic potential, muscular potential, that's where you need to be much more, you need to take a much more scientific approach.
Am I leaving lots of gains on the table by not doing blood flow restriction training? I mean, I've seen that. It looks like a pain in the butt to me to even set that stuff up, so I'm not really excited about that. But is there some research that says that this is just some super thing, or is it a fad?
It's neither nor. So you're not necessarily leaving gains on the table. It's certainly not a fad. It's a very viable way to train. And I think for certain instances, it's certainly like with rehab, for those who don't know, blood flow restriction is where you basically put a blood pressure cuff. And some people just use a tie. They'll use a band, or a knee wrap. So there's like practical blood flow restriction. But they'll put it on the proximal portion of the muscle, so just above the muscle they want to train. If you're going to do the biceps, you put it just under the deltoid. And then you do curls, let's say, for the biceps, or if you want triceps, you do tricep press downs. And it has very good research behind it that it does promote muscle growth. But you can use, so the weights are much lighter, and it gives you a pump. I mean, it is it can be somewhat painful too, because you get a big metabolite buildup as you're doing it. The question is, does it produce better gains than if you just did regular, traditional, higher load training? And the evidence does not seem to show that. But what's not clear is if you combine it with it. So again, when you look at one versus another, that's not necessarily the best way to go about looking at something, because training is not necessarily an either or choice. So the question is, can you get more gains perhaps from integrating blood flow training? It's not really clear. Certainly, I don't think you're not leaving a lot of gains on the table. Could it potentially help to enhance muscle growth? I think that is still a possibility. There are mechanistic reasons why hypoxia, which this creates what's called a hypoxic effect, can potentially enhance gains, but whether that translates into practical results is still to be determined.
I did some, and I still kind of mess with some competitive rowing for a while. And one of the techniques some people would use is they would just do this awful hard workout and then just not move and not try to clear all the metabolites and try to let it just sit there and soak in. It was very painful and miserable, but supposedly it allowed your body to adapt to that and to absorb those things more quickly so that you could perform better. So I don't know if there's I'm sure there's some analogous thing going on. What about as far as hydration and performance, strength? How important is that? Because there's some people talk about sodium loading prior to training. I train pretty much in a low carb state most of the time, or pretty much all the time, and so I find that by taking in salt and water, I'm better hydrated. Does that have a significant performance benefit?
Well, if you're starting your work dehydrated, then that's a problem, obviously. For resistance training, you're generally not going to have issues. Hydration becomes a big factor in sports, if you're a marathon runner, if you're a basketball player, a soccer player, et cetera, where you're doing you're out there and you're running around for long periods of time. Certainly you can get dehydrated relatively quickly in those situations, and it becomes an issue. But for the average individual, if you're talking about going into the gym and lifting, just drink some water, go to the water fountain every 15 minutes or so. Yeah. And you're not going to have issues.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's improved contractility depending on the hydration status of the muscle. Some people suggest maybe so.
If you're starting in a dehydrated state, yes. But as long as you're drinking throughout the day, that shouldn't be an issue. The point is you're not losing a lot of water from that type of training where it's going to that'll cause a serious need for hydration.
So the concept of a deload week was, I don't know when it came into vogue, but I never really was excited about that because I didn't like to stop training personally. How important is that? Something that we need to do? We have to do? Is there significant literature supports that, or is it still kind of one of those unknown things?
It's a great question, and it's kind of apropos you said that. So the answer to your second question is no. There's very little literature on the topic. There's been a few studies that have tried to touch on it to some extent, the effect of a deload, and the protocols are not really ecologically valid that have been used, meaning that they don't really represent what's done in the real world to a great extent. But the good news is that my master's student, Max Coleman, I'll give him a shout out, is about to embark on a study, the first study in trained lifters that will look at deloading, and we'll be carrying that out shortly and should have results by mid 2023.
No, I'll look forward to seeing if I need to take a week off or not. And let me ask you about that, because I'm an older guy. What is it? I seem to feel like if I take more time off, I seem to lose more. It just seems like, I could afford to take more time off when I was younger than I can now. Am I imagining that, or is there something to support that?
No, so there is, again, there's just not a lot of evidence, a lot of research on this, but there is some evidence that as you get older, you actually need a higher amount of volume to maintain. So those who gain, let's say you're young, you can maintain muscle on substantially less volume than someone who's older. There's been one study in particular that has shown that. And again, one study is always something that I'm very hesitant to draw strong conclusions from. But there is some evidence of that. I will say this too. A deload, that's another problem with deloads, because there's not even a universal consensus as to a definition. So is deload just reducing the load during a given week or more? First of all, how long is a deload? Is it just the load reduction? Is it a volume reduction? Is it both? Is it a frequency reduction? So you could, or is it completely taking time off from the gym? So these are all different. They would have different potential implications.
Let me ask you about the impact of cardiovascular training on subsequent or concurrent muscle building. Is there a disadvantage? Is there an advantage? Can I be a marathon runner and a power lifter at the same time? I know that's kind of an absurd question, but I mean, where does the extreme sort to eat into each other? Because there's a lot of hybrid athletes right now that are doing this and seem to be doing pretty well. What does the literature support as far as how much cardio can I do? Is HIIT better than walking on the treadmill or for muscle building? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it in your first comment that at the extremes, it certainly is. There's an inhibition of gains. So there's it's been long preached that there was this chronic interference effect. It's called the chronic interference hypothesis, where basically aerobic exercise is catabolic, resistance exercise is anabolic, and there's going to be interference between mTOR signaling, which is an anabolic pathway. It's an anabolic enzyme. And with aerobic exercise, it's basically going to antagonize mTOR and thus reduce gains. The recent research really throws cold water on that, at least at moderate levels of training in both respects. Now, again, it's hard to draw strong conclusions here because the studies that have been done are quite heterogeneous, meaning that they have different methodologies, and trying to lump them together to draw conclusions can be a little bit difficult in that respect. But I think it's reasonably clear now that if you do a modest aerobic routine, it is not going to have negative effects on your muscle gains. And in fact, in the early phases of training, so someone who's relatively new, if you're doing more high intensity training, there seems to be a benefit to aerobic exercise on muscle growth, at least. Strength is a little different. There does seem to be potentially a greater detriment to strength gains. But certainly from a muscle development standpoint, there's going to be an interference at some point. And also it depends upon your lifestyle, somewhat genetics too, but I mean, your sleep patterns, your nutrition, are you in a deficit? Are you in a caloric surplus, caloric deficit? That will have an effect. Your stress levels, your sleep levels, all of these factors need to be taken into account so we can draw general conclusions from the literature. But ultimately, it's going to come down to what the individual is doing.
So I'm sure you're familiar. There's this body by science sort of concept, around the Mike Mentzer HIIT training, the Arthur Jones stuff, the one set to failure, infrequent volume. Is that superior to anything else? Or what does the literature show on that particular aspect? Because a lot of people think body by science is the best way to train, and I'm going to do one set a week to failure or something using super slow reps. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there is absolutely zero evidence that it is superior. What I will say, and volume, there's quite a good body of evidence that higher volumes are better for hypertrophy. There's a dose response relationship, which has been shown consistently in research. Now, with that said, I mean, HIIT training is a viable way to train. I do believe you can most people can make a majority of their gains through a very modest volume routine. So training with fairly minimal volume can produce quite good results for most people. And it's certainly, to say it's superior from a time efficiency standpoint. So if you are time pressed, it can be a very viable training option. If you're willing, then you got to say, am I willing to leave some gains on the table? And if so, how much? So these are things that it would come down to the individual, but to call it superior from a results standpoint, there is no evidence of that, really zero.
So here's one that I think is less controversial is interset rest periods. It's like, 3 minutes or something like that, depending on what it is. There are some problems with packing your sets in too quickly, where you become more of a conditioning workout than an actual strength or hypertrophy. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so we carried out a study on this some years ago now, which has been cited quite a lot, where we had trained individuals using either a 3-minute rest or a 1-minute rest, doing the exact same routine, and overall the gains were better for the 3-minute rest than the 1-minute rest. And what we extrapolated from it, and this also does line up with some of the acute work that's been done, the muscle protein synthesis work, is that the volume load is going to be lower. So the total amount that you are able to lift, because you're going to have to reduce the load on the successive sets that you do. Now, with that said, the question is, if you do, you're going to have a quicker workout with let's say 1-minute rest. Supposing you did more sets, and you could probably even still get out quicker. We actually carried out a follow-up study, and it showed that if you did more sets, you got the same amount of gains. So if you equated the volume load, with 1-minute rest, you added on more sets to do the same amount of volume load. There was no difference in hypertrophy then. There were similar gains in hypertrophy.
So we're kind of looking at tonnage per week, basically, or something along those lines.
Correct.
Yeah. So
yeah, and again, these are the types of things that you have to kind of say, what is my goal and what is my lifestyle? How able am I to fit these things in my workout?
Okay, so I would be remiss, this is, I don't know if this is a group of people that mostly eat meat. We're kind of these nutty people that, for whatever reason, a lot of people have had significant health improvements for this. So let's talk about the role of carbohydrates in muscle building. Now, the literature I've seen says protein, training, and calories. I mean, is there some other sort of, do I have to have carbohydrates to make gains, or what does the literature seem to support?
To say you have to, you certainly don't have to need it to make gains. There is some literature showing that in ketogenic diets that the results are somewhat compromised. I mean, in a bodybuilding style routine, so if you're training, let's say, multiple sets, and this has been shown quite compellingly, multiple sets for 8 to 12 reps, the majority, roughly 70-80% of the energy that is utilized is from glycogen stores. Now, you're going to get some glycogen from gluconeogenesis, or you can, depending on the type of diet that you have. I don't think it's going to be a huge difference, but again, if you're the average person who just wants to make some gains, probably it's not going to be practically meaningful. But for a bodybuilder, I certainly would recommend that they would not do a ketogenic diet that would not optimize. Certainly, I think the literature suggests that it would not be optimal.
Yeah, I guess when we talk about bodybuilding, it's hard to dissociate drug usage from that, because that's pretty common. I think it's fair to say.
But even natural bodybuilding, yeah, I mean, if you're talking pro bodybuilding, but we have natural bodybuilding, which drugs are disassociated, and same thing. I would say anyone who's looking to eke out all the muscle growth they can, and that's been shown. Like I said, there's been a number of studies now in the literature with ketogenic diets that seem to show somewhat compromised gains, but it's not a lot. So I know there's also people that talk about, well, the ketogenic diet's terrible for muscle, but that's not what the literature shows. It shows that it tends to be somewhat inferior, but you still get good gains.
Yeah, I think some of the concern is it's just harder to eat in a caloric surplus, or can be. I mean, I guess you gorge on butter, you can do that, but I think the carbs facilitate eating. Where I know a lot of the top strongmen, they'll do, like I know a friend of mine, Stan Efferding, he's eating, having them eating rice with dextrose on it to stimulate their appetite, so they can weigh 380 pounds. And there is a satiety inhibiting effect, I think, to some degree with that.
And just I don't want to interrupt, but that's a great point. That it does seem that in general, the overall caloric intake tends to be somewhat compromised. So it does get harder, as you point out, to eat in a surplus, which is beneficial for optimizing gains, or even at maintenance, that when you start doing that, you tend to be in somewhat of a deficit.
Because I get this question all the time. How do I lose fat and gain muscle at the same time? It's almost like, you're really pushing it there. And particularly if somebody's relatively lean already, it seems like is that doable for the average person, or is it better just to suck it up, eat enough calories, be in a caloric surplus, put on the muscle, and then lose it off? Or can we make the lean gains?
So the best way to do it is to be an untrained individual that is overweight. And then you can do that quite readily. But for those who have been training and those who are relatively lean, recomposition is certainly possible, depending. So again, it will depend upon your training status. Someone who's like yourself, who's very well trained, will have a more difficult time doing that. And like yourself, someone who is quite lean will have a difficult time doing that. When you combine them, it gets harder and harder. We did a case study, my lab carried out a case study on a natural bodybuilder. And even around 12% body fat, he was slightly gaining a little bit of muscle while he was losing. He was in his pre-competition phase. Once he got under 10%, particularly under 8%, he just started losing muscle mass, like crazy lean mass. He was losing, for every pound he lost, like roughly half was from lean mass. So again, you can eke out some gains as you start getting, as you're well trained and you're low body fat, but the lower you are in body fat and the more well trained you are, the more difficult it is. Now, that is also discounting the elephant in the room, which is pharmacological use. If you're taking anabolic steroids, it becomes a lot easier to do.
Yeah, that seems to be the hard part, is to keep on muscle and stay lean at the same time without resorting to drugs. I think it's a challenging thing for most people. There's some people genetically just, gifted in a way that they, it's kind of crazy to see. What is there anything sort of up and coming, that topics that you guys are looking at that maybe is controversial or we don't have a good handle on yet?
Yeah, we have a lot of studies. So I'm very blessed to have a terrific group of students who carry out theses. So we have a master's program in human performance. Right now we're doing a supervision study, which is looking at the effects of supervision on muscle strength and growth and power. We have another one that is looking at the EMG effects on variable resistance versus eccentric overload versus regular just straight set training, which I think is going to be interesting. I mentioned the deload study. We have a study in weightlifting, so Olympic lifting, that is going to be looking at using the specialized techniques. So, yeah, a bunch of very cool studies coming on the horizon. Another one on, which is a little further away, but on superset training, on the effects of superset training on muscle growth.
Yeah, I mean, because you mentioned that's kind of these older techniques. Bodybuilders have tried everything. Drop sets, supersets, that type of stuff. Well, let me ask you, because I meant to ask you, because we talked a little bit about concentric and eccentric. How important is the eccentric phase of a lift with regard to hypertrophy and also with regard to strength?
Extremely important. Not only is it extremely important because tends to be greater force. So in a lengthening action, the type 2 fibers seem to take over to a greater extent. But what's really interesting is, from a muscle development standpoint, there's evidence that eccentric training tends to create greater growth in the distal portion of the muscle, whereas concentric actions seem to create greater development in the mid portion, at least in the quadriceps. This has been shown, which is really interesting. They have different eccentric and concentric actions, seem to have different anabolic signaling cascades, which would suggest, again, that they're promoting hypertrophy from different standpoints and that their combined use would be synergistic. So the evidence that we have seems to show that the combination of eccentric and concentric actions is greater than the sum total of either one.
You mentioned kind of a difference, a study between biceps and quads and mind muscle. Are there any major sort of differences between major muscle groups and how they're ideally trained? I know bodybuilders say you have to do like 1 million sets of calves because they're basically endurance muscles. Or is there any evidence to show that lats respond differently than biceps?
There is some evidence. Again, I wouldn't say it's strong, but some modest evidence that the lower body may need more volume than the upper body. I'm not
is
willing to take my my reputation on that in terms of what the literature shows. I think that we need more evidence to draw strong conclusions, but you can make a logical case just based on the fact that the lower body is used more too, so that it can be more stubborn to respond. But in terms of the calves, we've carried out calf studies have shown quite robust growth in the calves. So not enough. There haven't been enough calf studies to draw those types of conclusions.
How about this is a sort of a big topic: men versus women. Any significant differences we need to train women versus men? Are their muscles? Do their muscles respond differently? I think I've seen they do better with higher. They can train higher to their 1 rep max with more volume. What is the difference between men and women with training?
Yeah, so generally, I do not think you need to train them, men and women, differently. There's not much. Certainly, the response is quite similar, but there is some evidence that women do have greater recovery, particularly interset, between sets, that they can deal with shorter rest intervals and still and have better gains with the shorter rest than men do, and to some extent also recover better between workouts. There's some evidence that women do not get sore to the same extent. There's some thoughts that it might be because of estrogen has effects the effects of estrogen on soreness tend to dissipate the pain, the discomfort. But I don't really think that it, from a practical standpoint, means all that much in terms of how women should be trained from either a strength or hypertrophy standpoint. Perhaps you can make certain cases if their goal is muscular endurance that they might have a benefit there, or even aerobic endurance, but not from strength hypertrophy.
Is there any difference between a cross-sectional area of a man muscle versus a woman muscle with regard to force output? I mean, are they basically muscle and it doesn't matter who it's in?
Not on a fiber specific basis. So the actual force output of the fibers themselves are similar, but men generally, on average, are going to have larger cross-sectional areas, which are going to be able to produce greater force. So if you're talking about the cross-sectional area of a muscle, if you're talking about the cross-sectional area of a fiber, no. But if you're talking about the cross-sectional area of a whole muscle, a larger muscle will not generally necessarily, now there are some caveats to this, but only be able to produce greater force.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You see women that there's getting some very strong women that you see out there. Women that are squatting 500 plus pounds, deadlifting 500 pounds. And comparably, weight class aside, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. You'd see this at the lower weight classes in powerlifting. The 132s and 123 guys. I think they still outperform the women, if I'm not mistaken, even though they're similar size. Is that fair to say?
I don't really follow competitive powerlifting, so yeah. I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Okay, I think I'll have to look at the records, but that was the case at least in recent times. As far as let me give you I don't know. I know you have some social media, Brad. That's where I've kind of been following some of that stuff. Where do people find out more about what you do?
I mean, I just say Google me, but I mean, I'm on Instagram. Certainly, I have a very robust Instagram page, and Twitter. They're my two main outlets. It's Brad Schoenfeld, PhD on Instagram, and Brad Schoenfeld on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I really don't do that much on Facebook anymore because the algorithms suck, basically. And I still have not made the plunge to TikTok. Doing videos generally is not, at least on a consistent basis, isn't my thing. But yeah, I also have a blog. So if you just Google me, you'll find out all there is to know and all you might want to know.
Is there anything I missed on, Brad, that you want to share that people should know about strength and training in general?
No, I think you were really thorough. I just would close by saying that it's really important to understand the importance of research and to be, if you want to optimize your results, student research, but it's equally important to be a student of yourself because research is only going to provide guidelines. We've talked a lot about what research shows, et cetera, and I can provide general guidelines, but ultimately everyone comes down to what's called an N=1, where when I give general guidelines, general recommendations, you and any listener out there is going to need to say, all right, this is kind of starting points for me. And you got to play around with different things and figure out what works best for you, because there's a very wide difference between individuals on the manipulation of variables. And those who think that evidence-based practice is just, here's what the research shows, so this is going to tell me how to train, are sorely mistaken.
One, if you don't mind, one other topic: variable resistance training, or like bands, chains, things like that. Does that provide better either strength or hypertrophy gains?
Well, unto themselves, not necessarily, but when combined with traditional training, it potentially, there's again not a lot of research on this, but there's a good logical rationale where it can even out the strength curve. So if you add, let's say, bands to a barbell, and obviously this will be, I shouldn't even say obviously, but this would be specific to certain exercises more than others, because the strength curves differ based on the exercise that you're talking about. But there's I think a good logical rationale for it. It's not been well studied from a hypertrophy standpoint. From a strength standpoint, there is some decent evidence that it is additive and beneficial.
Perfect. All right, Brett, thank you so much for doing this, and appreciate keep putting out the literature so us people can, like you said, have a framework by which to sort of get a starting point. That's wonderful that you do that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, have a good day. Everybody, we'll see you guys back. Well, not tomorrow. I'm on a plane tomorrow, so we'll see you guys later. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye, Brett. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Shawn.